I think we'll go ahead and get started. It's 1:45, and we have a lot of great stuff to cover. I guess I'll use this.
Yeah, it's just.
So my name is Richard DeZariga. I'm a Microsoft Technology Center architect based in Dallas, and
I'm Nathan Miller, also from Dallas. I'm a technical specialist.
So today we're going to talk about building auto-hosted apps for SharePoint 2013. So I've had an opportunity to do a lot of work in the app model over the last year, and actually the auto-hosted apps are probably the area that I'm most excited about. I think I called it the voodoo magic, the things that they're doing behind the covers to make it easy for you to develop apps and get them out there either to your enterprise or to a store to where you could actually maybe make some revenue. Are really quite incredible. So just out of curiosity, who here's already developed apps for SharePoint 2013 so far? All right, decent amount of people. Just out of curiosity, has anyone ever developed a Facebook app? A few people develop Facebook apps. All right, there's some interesting similarities between them, and we'll kind of point those out as we go along. Is anyone here, there's really kind of two models for these apps, and we'll kind of talk about those, but there's where I could build these apps and run them privately in my enterprise, and then there's kind of the whole store model to where I could put these apps in the store. Who here is interested in for their enterprise? Okay, that's a good majority. Who's interested in maybe building some cool apps for the store and making some money on the side? All right, very cool. All right, well, I'm going to turn it over to Nathan, and we'll walk through a few things. Actually, let me talk a little bit about assumptions. So we're assuming that you guys, this is a 300-level developer track, so we hope that you're not scared of breaking into code. We're actually going to build some really cool solutions together on stage, so just to kind of set that up. The other thing is, although we'll kind of cover a lot of things on general apps for SharePoint, I do want to point out that because this is a 300 level, we have some assumption that you guys have gone to some of the other sessions that help kind of build up to this. So some of the really basic things around apps for SharePoint we'll touch on very slightly, but probably not to the depth that some of the other sessions did. We want to make sure that you guys get a good understanding of these types of apps. So with that, I will give it to Nathan.
All right, so when we looked at kind of the evolution of development in SharePoint, in 2007 we started out, and really it was actually, I guess, even pre-tooling. We would actually deploy DLLs, we'd put them in the GAC, and then kind of be on our way. Then 2010 was when we introduced the sandbox. It was too limited, though, and so especially when we looked at some of our scenarios for our cloud scenarios where we wanted to actually do more with development, it was just challenging for the most common scenarios of getting data and displaying it on a page through sandbox solutions. So then we get to 2013, and this is really what we're going to kind of cover today, is not just with the app model that we've got, but how we can actually leverage the SharePoint, the client APIs, and the client server object model as well. So we're going to cover some of that, as well as how we actually do the infrastructure hosting of this app that lives in the cloud in this instance. So when we look at the different app models for hosting options that we've got, we have two of the cloud-based models. And so there's some confusion around where does the code run in the cloud. Does it have to run on Azure? Does it run on the different my-premise? Well, so that's the provider-hosted app model. So if I want my infrastructure for my business logic to run in some other hosted service, or if I want that to run on-premise, I'm looking at the provider-host model. If I want to have everything kind of auto-deployed and provisioned and have a tenant in Azure to do that, that's this auto-hosted model. So there's some constraints around that, but we'll kind of go through that. The nice thing about it, the value of that is it's very easy to get started, and you don't have to worry about configuring all the Azure endpoints and all that. That's all done for you automatically. And then obviously the SharePoint hosted app model, which they've covered in other sessions as well. So more of the just client-side object model side. So in this session, we're really going to focus on the auto-hosted app model and cover how that gets provisioned. So in our different app models, we're going to show you there's a couple parts to it. So there's the host web, there's an app web, and then there's the business logic that lives in Azure. So I'm going to go through kind of some of the different capabilities and where those different capabilities live in the framework. So for example, workflow. Does anyone know if you're developing workflow in 2013, where's that going to live in this model? Azure? Yep. So lists and libraries. I want to create lists and libraries and add that to my auto-hosted model. Anyone? Yep, in the app web. And then client web parts. Yep, host web. And custom actions. The host web also. And then a web part page. And managed code goes into Azure. So that's the value, right? Is if I want to do business logic, I want to do managed code, we can actually deploy all that in Azure. I can still have that integration pieces because I've got client web parts, I've got custom actions. I can deploy lists and libraries and web part pages all within my SharePoint project that gets deployed in this auto-hosted model as well. Oh, two more. Database. Okay, so when we look at the application lifecycle, the model that we're going to show you, and we're going to kind of walk through this with a couple apps, but basically you start with an app developer, you go ahead and create your auto-hosted app, it generates an app file. Once you actually deploy the app file, you give it to the tenant admin, that Richard came up with the picture, by the way, not me, and he actually deploys it into the app catalog. So the app catalog really is meant for kind of corporate apps. So if I want to develop corporate apps, I don't have to go into the storefront and do that. I can actually give that app file to my admin. He actually loads that up into our app catalog. A site owner sees that. That's an available app for them to do. Once they actually deploy that app into their site, it provisions the website. It provisions a SQL database for that instance. It also provisions any workflows that they've got for that instance as well. If I've got a second site owner and they provision it, it also does the website, the database, and a workflow scenario as well. So that's kind of the value that you get with this auto-hosted app model. It basically creates its own instance for each of these tenants that are running. Once the developer decides, hey, I can make some money doing this, he can actually put it to the app store. So if he goes through the app store, goes through that process, we could have another tenant, and they could actually subscribe to it. And once they actually deploy it onto their sites, it also provisions all those in its own tenants as well. So again, all this happens automatically, and it's a pretty amazing framework.
Yeah, and just to maybe expand on the Azure side of this, one of the things, again, that I think so magical about this is, as a developer, it's really just automatic for me, right? As long as I package my app, all of that happens behind the scenes, and actually even more. Behind the scenes, like the database, we're re-hooking up the database to the web application, because you can imagine things like connection strings change, and you can imagine dealing with things like disaster recovery. We're automatically doing things like geo-distributing these databases around all of our data centers or to other data centers with Azure. And if we need to fail over to that, again, it's all automatic with the Azure model.
So we're going to go ahead and jump into the demo. We're going to start with, actually on this demo, we're going to start with the end solution, and then we're going to walk through how to build this type of application, auto-hosted application.
All right, so we wanted to think through some cool scenarios that would really resonate with you guys in terms of why I might build some of these different auto-hosted apps. And actually, what we decided is for the first app, we really didn't want people to get lost in the details of an app. We wanted to really concentrate on the different components that go together to build an app. So we did something kind of fun. And so who's heard of Movember before? Anyone heard of Movember? So it's a charity thing for men, basically, to bring to I guess, light men's health issues. And so we created a Movember app. So I'm here within, this happens to be one of my developer sites, so I'm going to go into the Movember app here. And what you'll see is kind of the end result. We're going to build this together so you'll see how we can do something like this. So I have my Movember wheel. I have my profile picture that was actually able to pull out from SharePoint. I have a spin wheel, and then I can post to the news feed. One of the things that I want to point out here, and we'll look at kind of the difference between these scenarios, but if I were to zoom in, you'll see that I'm actually running localhost right now. So I'm in a debug mode for this app, and I'm actually in localhost. And so what happens is, even though it looks like SharePoint, I have the Chrome of SharePoint around it, I'm actually outside of SharePoint now. SharePoint posted some information to this app, and I'm going to be able to not only use that posted information, but actually call back and get more information out of my SharePoint site. So the way this app works is I can go out here, I'll click spin the wheel, and we'll go and spin, and it looks like I'm going to get a rocker. mustache for Movember, and I'll go ahead and say post to newsfeed. And ultimately, that's going to go and basically do a round trip. In this case, we're actually going to store the history in SQL Azure, so we'll actually keep a record of that in Azure. So you can see here's the two that I've done. And also, because we have rich ties back into the application API, the SharePoint API, if I go to my newsfeed, what we'll see is that I should have my mashup that got added to the SharePoint site. So kind of a silly example, but the idea is if I was an enterprise and I was human resources and maybe instead of Movember we wanted to do something for like Breast Cancer Awareness Month, we could do really nice pointed apps that are pretty easy to put together.
I'm not sure what that app would be, but...
Wow. All right, so let's start. Let's build this app together. So I'm going to go ahead and close out of here. We're going to start in really an empty project here. So I'm in Visual Studio. I'm going to go out and I want to create a brand new app. We're going to call this guy Movember. And for those that haven't pulled down the tooling, basically there are some app templates for Visual Studio. So if I go under Office and SharePoint, you can see I can build apps for Office and apps for SharePoint. So I'm going to go ahead and create an app for SharePoint. The first thing that it's going to ask me to do is name my app and give it a URL that I'm going to debug with. So this is one of the big values. There was a very large cost of entry to do SharePoint development in the past. So, if you guys have done SharePoint development, like best case scenario, I have this honking 32 gig of RAM laptop that I can carry around with me, or maybe a VM that I connect to in one of our Hyper-V or VMware environments. Here, I can now leverage Office 365. We really did this app model to be cloud first, and so that's what I'm doing is I'm going to connect to a tenant inside of Office 365. You can see that I'm selecting the default, which is auto-hosted. I could change this to provider-hosted or SharePoint-hosted, but we are doing auto-hosted this session, so I'll go ahead and jump into that. So as soon as it creates this app, let's have Nathan maybe describe a little bit about what you guys see here.
So any auto-hosted app actually has two parts to it. So you'll see there's the app part itself that actually is going to live in SharePoint or in Office 365 in this case. And then there's also a web part, or a web page application as well. The nice thing about this is whenever you're provisioning this, you're not stuck with the out-of-box web solution that deploys for you. So if you want to do an MVC type of pattern, you can actually do that. And then in the properties down below, you just change the web project attribute and point to the solution that you want to deploy out there. So when we deploy this, the web solution will actually run local when we are actually running debug mode, but will actually get deployed into Azure. And then the Office 365 will actually have the app side as well. So if we add any client-side web parts, or if we add any lists, it goes into the app. If we add any business logic databases, it actually gets bundled into the web solution and gets deployed into Azure.
So let's maybe, just really quickly, let's kind of show you that difference, just to kind of prove that the magic's there. So what I'm basically doing right now is a debug. So I just did F5 within the browser here. This lately, as you guys know, we've had a few network hiccups this week at SharePoint conference, and so this has been taking, okay, so it went ahead and finished. It's only 22 seconds, not too bad. So I'm in my app. The first thing it's going to ask me to do is trust it. We'll talk about that concept of trusting, but I will go ahead and trust my app. And then once I'm in here, I'm going to get a null token. So that's fine. I'm going to go ahead and skip around that. What I want to point out here is that, again, I am in localhost to do this. So if I were to zoom in on... There we go. I'm in localhost. You can see that I'm in localhost for debug. Let's go ahead and deploy this just really quickly just to kind of show you the difference. So I'm just going to right-click and say deploy now. And that will actually, this time, it's going to first uninstall the app, but then it's going to automatically package this and deploy it out to Windows Azure. Try that again. The other thing that I can do here from my app is that, again, if I wanted to pass this off, this is really during the development process of me getting my app ready. Once my app has gone through testing and I'm ready to actually deploy it, whereas I've been doing a debug and a deploy, I also have the ability to do what's called publish. And when I publish this, it's actually going to go out and create a .app file. So everyone's familiar with WSP files, hopefully, if you've done SharePoint development, which is basically a cab file of your solution. So the difference with the app is the .app has that WSP file plus a bunch of other things, right? So for instance, what we'll see is if I were doing an app that used SQL Azure, it'll actually have files in there that will help provision the database. It will have files in there that basically have a web deploy solution so that it can deploy the site components of our application. So it's been successful. It's deployed it. I'll go ahead and say trust. And the difference is if you guys look at the URL now, and this, we haven't really added anything to our app, but if I were to zoom in, you can see it's this nice long GUID.o365apps.net. So o365apps.net is Microsoft's own Azure instance, right? So it's our Azure instance that these things get hosted on. So that's very important. It's important from a visibility perspective. So if you guys have your own Azure and you have the visibility to go in and look at all the details of how your Azure is being used, we do give you some visibility, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But in a lot of ways, we mask that all from you. You don't have to deal with that. We manage it. We manage how it's replicated. We manage all those components. But this is what it looks like when our app is deployed. So, before we actually start building some of the components of our app, let's walk through a few really important concepts that are going to make up this app. So, the first thing I want to talk about is, when we think about the app we're going to build, we have different ways to surface that application inside of SharePoint, right? So, if you think about it, I have SharePoint on one end, and my app's running somewhere else. To make it seem like one experience, there's really three ways that I do that. So one is I can display my app in a full screen mode. So it can take up really the entire view of the browser real estate. So that's actually the default experience. So whereas we just created a blank app, didn't really do anything in it, as soon as I pressed F5, you saw it went to the app in a full screen mode. My other options are I can do a SharePoint dialog. So I could create a custom action that launches my dialog, and in that case, I have one part of the browser window. The final one is an app part. So an app part is basically putting your app in a web part ultimately. It's kind of like a page view or a web part on steroids, if you will. Because what we're doing is not only are we bringing up the URL that app lives in, we're also posting a lot of important information. So we're posting information so that the app has context of how it's running. If you guys think about that, so we're kind of moving back to this world of a bunch of iframes. And that kind of initially when I heard it scared me a little bit. I fear that we're going to end up with these SharePoint sites that every little window looks completely different from each other, and it looks very kind of separated. In the SharePoint hosted app, so I don't know if anyone's gone to the SharePoint hosted apps, we make it a little bit more simple for you to take on the look and feel of your SharePoint site. But here, I have my SharePoint site, and I have my app running completely somewhere different. It's over in Windows Azure. So let's talk about how we can make a nice user experience for these apps. So my first option for a full-page app, I can leverage what's called the Chrome control. So this is a special control that I can load up basically by referencing the host app, the host site. I can go pull up what the Chrome looks like. So if you've applied a certain look and feel, maybe you picked a black color scheme. If I've done that and I go to my app and I leverage the Chrome control, the app will have that exact same look and feel to it. So it'll kind of surround the app with certain things like menu items. I can bring in the title from the site. I can bring in the icon from the site. All those sort of things are more automatic. If I'm not doing that, if I'm doing a dialog app or if I'm doing something that's like an app part, then what I want to do is I want to make sure I reference the styles from the host site. So I can actually go out and reference those styles, pull those in, and then automatically be able to leverage the look and feel in that way. So again, very important. Chrome control, it's more for full-page apps, and importing styles are more for the app parts or dialogues. The Chrome control automatically brings the styles in, so you don't have to do it in that case. Also, if you think about app parts, you could think, inside that iframe, things could render differently. So one thing that we've done that's pretty interesting is we're leveraging some of the post message framework that's part of HTML5 to where I can actually do a post message outside to SharePoint that will actually go through and resize my app part on the SharePoint page. So that's something else you can think about, is to size your app parts appropriately. All right, next thing, app permissions. So app permissions, if you think about, if I were to go and write an app, if that app is connecting back to SharePoint, now with all these numerous APIs that we have available to you, that might be scary for someone that owns that tenancy, right? Because if I have some app somewhere else, it might be able to go out and get sensitive information. It might be able to, read profile information we don't want it to see. And so a very important component of building apps is app permissions. So these are configured in the app manifest. I can go in that manifest and I can specify very granular permissions to say you can do searches, you can have write access to the social feed, you can do all these certain things, and that's very specifically called out in that app manifest. During installation, you're going to be prompted to actually give these permissions. So the tenant that's installing the app, it'll say, hey, this app wants to be able to leverage search. Do you want to allow that? Behind the scenes, we're not going to get into all the OAuth things that make this possible, but Azure's Access Control Services plays a big role in this. So ACS is going to handle a lot of the OAuth handoffs and see, hey, here's an access token for your app that will give you access to very specific capabilities. So that is an important part of this app model. So I asked you guys at the very beginning, who's developed a Facebook app? So a quick show of hands again, who's done a Facebook app before? Okay, so there's a few people out here. I want to kind of point out the similarities between this. So here is an app that I built inside of Facebook. So you can see on the left, I have basically where I configure the permissions for my app. So I might say that I want to be able to get the birthday for the user. And then what happens is when it's in Facebook and someone actually starts using the app, you can see that it stops them there and says, hey, this app wants your basic information, it wants your email address, it wants your birthday, and it wants your location. That's the same concept. It just happens to be in the Facebook model. So here's the exact same thing when we go to the SharePoint world. So here I have my, where I set my permissions there at the bottom. You can see I have permissions for the web, user profiles, and a tenant permission. And then you can see where it stops me and prompts me for that. There's a number of additional things inside the app manifest that we'll get into. So that manifest is not just for permissions. I can specify, the title of my app, icon, start page, query string, all kinds of rich information can be specified in there. I can even specify prerequisites. So if I need certain features activated in order for this app to run, I can specify that in there. Also supports things like what locales the app supports and any sort of remote endpoints that you might need to invoke from the app. Kind of moving on to app storage. So I really have two options for app storage. So I can store data inside of SharePoint lists. I think everyone, if you're a SharePoint developer, you know the pains involved with that. You end up, instead of getting to deal with nice, friendly SQL, you deal with nice, unfriendly CAML, and that is unchanged. So if you guys want to leverage list storage, you can, but you're going to end up doing a lot in CAML. It's also not the most efficient for reporting. My next option is SQL Azure, and to me, this is really the really cool part of this, that I can develop, inside of my project, a database, inside my solution, a database project, and just by referencing that project or just a DAC file, I can automatically provision the database. And then from my code, I can reference that in a couple of different ways. I can either get a full-fledged SQL connection object, or I can get the raw connection string to be able to leverage that. I'm not going to go into this in too much detail, but this shows the two different ways of leveraging that. So if you download the slides, you can see my two ways. So I can and for those that are kind of done some things with auto-hosted apps, This is actually based on what's in RTM. So I don't think there's any documentation out there on the new way of doing this. During kind of the preview, we had a way to where you could use a very specific connection, an app setting, and it would update your connection information.
About debugging.
So Nathan mentioned, so what about debugging? So, and we'll look at this. So when I debug, I have a couple of different things that occur. So if I look at these two different ways of doing things, if I get the SQL connection object, that will automatically work inside in debugging if I put my connection string in a very specific, with a very specific name. So local DB instance for debugging is what I use. If I want the raw connection string, that does not work in debugging. So I can't call the API to get the connection string during debugging. We'll take a look at this. But what I can do is I can do a really quick condition. I can try to get the raw connection string, and if that comes back empty, then I can automatically just pull it out of my app, my web.config. So we'll look at that. All right, so that was really all the slides that we're going to do. The rest of the time we're going to spend building a couple of cool apps. So the first one obviously is our Movember app. So I want to build this Movember app. I have basically my empty project here, and I'm going to just kind of do a few kind of just house cleaning things right off the bat. So I have some files that really aren't very interesting. So things like, taking my application icon. So I'll go ahead and copy this guy in here, replace it. I also have some image files and just some really simple entities and utils that I want to be able to leverage inside of my project. So I'm going to go ahead and take these guys and I'm going to put them in my web project. So really that just sets up some of the basic information that I want to do in here. I am going to go ahead and go with web forms for this. You can certainly do MVC. If you guys are MVC fans, the Build Conference the other week had some really good sessions around doing this with MVC. I feel like if you're a SharePoint developer, you've lived in a web forms world, you're probably going to be more familiar with web forms, and so that's why I'm going to do it in this way during the demonstration today. But if I wanted to, I could go to my app project, and I could ultimately just re-reference a different web project down here. So it allows me to specify the web project that I want to use. The other thing I want to do is, because this project is going to leverage social, or at least user profiles, I want to go ahead and specify, I need to add references to a few things. And this is going to be an important thing for you guys to do when you build your apps. So I'm going to go over to extensions here, and I'm going to find a very specific reference. So this is one of the new CSOM classes that I'm going, or assemblies that I'm going to use. So I'm going to use Microsoft.SharePoint.client.user profiles. So that's a brand new assembly that I can now leverage to work with my user profiles. So I'm going to go ahead and say OK to that. It's going to add it to my project. Here's the really important thing. Once you add that to your project, by default, it's going to be set up not to copy local. So if I wanted to package this up and send it out to Azure, all of a sudden my apps won't work. Well, the reason is it didn't take that assembly out with it. So if I click on the user profile assembly, you can see here I have copy local equals false. I want to really quickly change that over to true so that it'll take that assembly with me. So that's an important thing. It's not a default thing. Any extra assemblies that you might reference. The next thing I want to do is I need a couple of libraries. So remember, right now my solution is made up of two projects. It has my SharePoint project and my web application project that's going to be off in Azure. So in my SharePoint project, I want two libraries. I want one library for my mustaches, and I want one library for the mashup that we finish with. So when we put the mustache on top of the person's picture. So I'm going to go and right-click. I'm going to add a new item. In this case, I'm going to add a list, and this first one I will call Mustache Library. If you've worked with this, there's a really nice way of dealing with lists and libraries now. So it's going to ask what type of library or list I want. So I'm going to say I want a regular document library. Go ahead and say finish. I'm going to fix a few things up here. I want a little bit cleaner of a path to my library. So when it creates this library, it's also going to create a list instance. And so that's one of the things that I want to make sure I clean up is the URL to my list instance.
So here's the UI that I get to modify my library. If I want to add new columns, I can do all that from here. I'm going to go ahead and go with the default. But what I do want to do is in my solution project over here, I do want to modify that list instance. Libraries typically don't have list / in front of it, so you can see here that it put that. I'm just going to remove list in front of it and kind of make it a little bit cleaner. The next thing that I want to do is add another library. This one's going to be for the mashup itself. So I'll go ahead and add another library. This one we'll call the Movember library. Same thing, I want to go ahead and create a document library, and I'll just say finish. And similar to before, I'm going to remove the lists in front of this to keep it just a little bit cleaner. All right, so I have my two libraries. The next thing is I've already created some really cool mustache pictures. So I'm going to go ahead and add a module. So a module would be my way of putting those images into my library. So I'm going to go ahead and say I want to create a new item. I'm going to create a module, and I'm going to call this mustaches. And I'll go ahead and, as you guys know, module has a text file there by default. I'll delete that. And what I want to do is go ahead and I have some mustaches. Here's my various mustaches. And I will go ahead and copy those and paste these into my module. So a few things that I want to do here that are really important. One is, this is the wrong URL, right? If you look at this, it's going to put the mustaches under a mustaches URL. I want those to go in my mustaches library. So I would easily just come in here and change this to mustaches library. The other thing I want to do is I want to set the title for each one of these document libraries. So instead of typing this out in front of you guys, I'm going to pull out just a really quick code snippet so you guys don't have to deal with that. So here you can see, very simply, all I did was say I want the images to go into the mustaches library, and I want to set the title for each one. So I have my module now. All right, the next thing I'm going to do is, you guys don't want to see me write a bunch of HTML, so I'm going to take just my completed HTML page. Do one thing here real quick. I'm going to just really quickly take my HTML page from that's pre-created and dump it off in here. So now I have some scripts. You guys, I'm going to provide all the code for you guys for this and all the other demos that we have, so you can go out and get it. Basically, it's just some script that helps do the spinning of the wheel, set some properties behind the scenes, does some things like that. The one thing I do need to do in here, because it's going to bark at me, is wire up the button click event for submitting. So I'll go ahead and create a new event for that. And I want to go ahead and just pre-bind some things. So I'm going to take what was in the page load, and again, just using a quick little code snippet, I'm going to go ahead and insert the initial section here, the page load area. And I'll reference a few things. So just to explain what's going on in here, I'll kind of walk through this. It's pretty simple. I'm basically first getting the current user. I'm getting their profile picture using the APIs. Again, this is all client-side object model. I'm then going to my mustaches library and just doing a very simple camel query that says, give me them all, but I want the title. And then I'm binding that to the mustaches wheel, which is just a repeater control. The final thing that I need to do in order to deploy this is I need to provide this some permissions. Permissions are going to be very important because I'm trying to go out and get user profile information. So I'll go ahead and go out here to permissions, and I want to give the, in this case, I'm going to give the user profiles read access. And I also want to the tenancy, I want write, which basically is going to allow me to write to the news feed at the end of this. So I'll go ahead and say save. And let's see how far we're at. So there's a few things that are going to be lacking here that we're going to want to be able to do later on. But I want to at least see how far we've gotten with this. So let's go ahead and do a deploy. So some of the things that we've done here is basically gotten the basic UI together. We've gotten the ability to go out and connect to the user profiles to be able to pull in things like a picture URL so that I can reference the picture of the user. And then we're also doing some things to populate the library with the mustaches. In this case, we haven't yet leveraged things like the Chrome control. So what you're going to see is when we go into this app at first, it's going to be pretty bland. We're not going to have any styling. It's not going to look like it lives in the SharePoint site. Hopefully this will highlight how important it is to be really cognizant of doing styling when you're creating these apps, because they do live completely outside of SharePoint. Hopefully this won't take too long to deploy. It usually, on this network, it's been doing decent lately. There we go. We're deployed. So here's our app. It should prompt us for certain permissions. So, we talked about permissions. You can see here it's asking me for access to user profiles and some general information to the site. We have our app icon. I'm going to go ahead and say trust. And once we get in here, we'll have some basic information that's displayed. Again, I'm having session. Do that one more time. For those that have done development, one thing I'll kind of caution you guys to be really careful about, I probably have like 12 tenants in Office 365 right now, and I go to different ones for different things. Be really careful as you go into different tenants on staying signed in, might want to do in private browsing when you go to some tenants, because you can get into some cases where there are some session issues, and looks like I'm having some session issues here. I'll try it one more time, and if this doesn't work, we'll move on. Ultimately, what you should see here is that we're going to have basically a very bland user interface. Let's do this. All right, so that's not going to be cooperative with us. We'll try to go in here in just a moment. So what's happening here, and actually this is a pretty important thing to talk about, is that when you go to the app, when I'm inside of the app is going to need certain context. It's going to need contact information from SharePoint. And so the app is actually set up to where if it doesn't have context, it redirects back to the SharePoint site to get context and then come back. And so there's some issues right here to where it's thinking the session that it's not there in session. But we'll walk through this further. So in order for me to leverage the Chrome control, there's a few things that I want to do. The first thing is, and I think this is a pretty neat little trick, is if I just load my page and then behind the scenes try to go get the Chrome control and add it, what you'll see is a really bad formatted screen that all of a sudden becomes formatted nicely. Well, to me, that's not a good experience. I want to hold off on showing the user the screen until they've actually completed pulling in the Chrome control. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to go into the body of my app, and or body of my page, and I'm going to set the style to where the display, by default, the whole body is going to be set to none. So it's not going to show anything in the page until that Chrome control completes loading. The next thing I'm going to do is I do have a nifty little, what I call UX script that helps add all of the Chrome control, or actually set the rest of the information for like styles depending upon how the app is used. So I'm going to go and add this to my scripts library. So again, you guys can leverage this. It's a single file that'll do it either way. Ultimately, what this is looking for, if I were to go, I put that in the wrong place. If you look at the UX script, it's basically going to be looking to see what the display type. So in the URL, I'm going to pass whether or not this is being displayed in full screen or if it's being displayed as an iframe. And actually, to kind of illustrate that, I'm going to need to change the query string of my app. So again, that is one of the things that's done in the app manifest. So if I go in the app manifest, you can see that I can specify not only the start page of my app, but I also have the ability to set the query string of my app. And in this case, by default, you're going to get what's called standard tokens. So standard tokens are going to be, we'll give the app the URL you're coming from, and if it has an app web on the SharePoint side, what that app web URL is. I want some additional things. I want to know what the image, the icon is for the site. I want to know what the title of the site is. I want to know a lot of additional information. So I'm going to go and add some additional query parameters to this. So you can see I added quite a bit here. The last one is the important one. And this is just my own little thing, is I'm telling it through the URL that this is going to be displayed in full screen mode. So when that UX script executes, it can go check that and say, what display mode is it? Oh, this one's being displayed inside of a full screen, therefore I need the Chrome control. What this will allow me to do is I can use the exact same page for a full screen page or an app part. So it's really nice to be able to re-leverage the same page in two different ways. We'll actually see that here when we go to one of our second apps. All right, so I've added that. I also need to go ahead and reference the script in my page. So let me go back to the top of my page and add reference to my script file. So this is JavaScript, and its source is going to be very similar to the one above. Notice that the apps are already automatically going to reference jQuery. So we pre-packaged jQuery as part of these apps, the template by default, so you guys can leverage that. And this is UX script.js. All right, so now that we have this reference, I'll give this another try. I might be still having some session issues with this, but we'll see if it will cooperate with us and display our app. So in this case, you notice if you look at the bottom on the output window, it's actually uninstalling the app. Any change that you make on the SharePoint side of things is going to cause the app to completely uninstall and reinstall. So because I changed the app manifest, it's going to uninstall and reinstall that app. So that's an important thing. Typically, if I just make little code changes to the web application, it's very easy for me to go through this without having to do the reinstall. It's a lot faster. So we're going through the installation, hopefully here in a couple minutes. That will be good. So our app is installed. Again, because it did a complete uninstall, it's going to ask me to trust it again. So I'll go ahead and say trust it. And I'm still having session issues. So we might have to look at the end result of this. So ultimately, all that would do was give me my nice UI. It would allow me to spin. But what I want to do now, let's go ahead and get into the interesting part of this, which is actually doing storage with my app. So in this case, I want to set up my app to store all the Movember submissions into a database. So again, this is some of the really interesting stuff of the new auto-hosted apps. So what I'm going to start by doing is there's a few different approaches to this. I'm going to use the entity framework. So you guys have a number of different ways that you could connect to a database, a SQL database. You could do just pure, using the SQL client assemblies. I want to use entity framework. I feel like it's a lot easier to use. For those that are familiar with entity framework, there's kind of two approaches. You can do entities first, or you can do data model first. And it really depends on what you're more comfortable with. I thought that it would be helpful to start database first so that you can see some tools that maybe you haven't used before. So one of those is local DB. So some people, if you have like a full-fledged developer machine, you might have full SQL installed on there. So we've kind of gone away from SQL Express and put automatically with Visual Studio, we put local DB, which is kind of similar to IIS Express for web hosting. It's the database version of that. So I'm going to quickly just create a database for this project. So I'm going to run a quick script here. So this is SQL local DB, and I want to create, and we'll call this the Movember ODS SPC. So it's going to be our Movember ODS SPC instance. So I'll go ahead and create that. That's going to automatically create an instance of the database for us. So now I'm ready to go and actually start putting a database together. So what I'm going to do in my project is I'm going to go out and in my solution is add a new project to my solution. This is going to be a database type of project. So I'm going to go down here and create a SQL Server project. So I'll call this Movember ODS. And I'm going to get a blank database project in this case. So before I add anything, what I want to do is I want my SharePoint app to know about SQL Azure in this case, that it has SQL components to it. So if I go to the actual app itself, down in the app settings, what you'll see at the bottom of the app settings for the project is I have the ability to either leverage a SQL database script or a database project. So what I want to do is I'll go over here and click on the drop down, and there's my Movember ODS. As soon as I select it, you can see it's giving me a warning. By default, when you create a SQL database project, it's normal SQL. Well, what this needs to do is the app needs it to be SQL Azure. So it's going to actually change it on the fly. It's going to say, hey, we want to change this to SQL Azure project type, and I'm going to go ahead and say OK. So now it's set up to leverage SQL Azure, and now we can start creating some tables. So I'm going to go ahead and just in here, I'll create a really quick table. So I'll call this Movember History. So there's our Movember history table. And again, for the sake of time, I'm just going to jump in here. And it's just a create table statement, nothing too exciting. But we give you a nice UI to build your tables if you want. But I'm just going to paste it in here, and it'll put all my columns. These databases, it'll support everything from views to stored procedures. You can do all those things in here. You can even do things like post-deployment scripts. We'll take a look at where I might want to do something like that, like seed the table with some data at the very start of it getting deployed. In this case, I just want to create a pretty simple table. So I'll go ahead and say OK to that. So the next thing I want to do is, in order for me to do entity framework database first, the database has to exist. Well, right now the database doesn't exist, so I want to go ahead and deploy it. So I'm just going to right-click my project. I'm going to publish it. It's going to ask, well, where do you want to publish it to? And so in this case, I can just say local DB. And that would not be what I want to paste in there. And it's Movember ODS SPC. And our database name. If I were to say test connection, it'll fail because at this point I haven't published it yet, but I'll just say OK and say publish. Down here at the bottom, you'll see that it's going to go out and publish that database and create it for me. Again, as soon as I do this, then I can start going and creating my entity model. So that's done. Now I can go to my web project. Again, the web project's what's going to need to leverage the entity framework. So I'm going to go over here and basically add a new item. In this case, it's a data item, the ADO.NET entity model, and I will call this, we'll call it Movember model. So in this case, I am going to generate from a database. I'll go ahead and create a new connection to it, same connection as before, local DB, Movember ODS SPC. Now, if I test connection, succeeds, go ahead and say OK. I'm going to call this, just to simplify it a little bit, Movember entities. I can pick whatever I want. In this case, I just have my single table. It's a pretty simple one. And I'll go ahead and say finish. So now I have my model. A few things. I have a little kind of quirk with my developer environment where it generates it kind of a way that I don't want. So I'm going to delete these TT files here really quickly. And I want to set my model to have a code generation strategy of default. All right, so I basically have my entity model. I can start leveraging the entity framework in here now. The first thing I want to do is show you how we might connect to this database. So first, the first thing I might want to do is when I actually come into the app in my page, the first thing I might want to do is actually go and pull the history. So here at the bottom, after I've done everything else, I'm going to add a quick little code snippet that might allow me to actually go and pull that information out. So I'm just going to insert a snippet here, and we'll talk about what it is. So get history. You can see that I'm using my entity model. Let me do one other thing here real quick. I excluded a file earlier that I want to include again. Okay, so I'm using my entity model, and I'm passing in, I have basically a little connection util that's going to get the connection string for this app. And it's actually using the client context. That's going to be really important in these auto-hosted apps. When I go and I push this out into Azure, again, the connection string is going to change, and I need to be able to use that accordingly. So if I were to go and look at this in more detail, let me show you what this is doing. So using the client context, I'm calling this important new method here, if I zoom in, I'm doing app instance.receive app database connection string. So that's a brand new part of the object model. And this is new. This is not published out there yet. It was different in the preview. But I can use this API to go out and get my raw connection string. However, remember, the raw connection string does not work in debug mode. So this won't work in debug mode. It's going to come back empty. So what you'll see in here is that I have a little check. If the connection string is null or empty, go grab it from my web config under the connection string section. So that's a really important thing. The other important thing is that when Azure goes and provisions this database, it's going to put a connection string in there that is not an entity framework connection string. It's going to put a normal SQL connection string in there. So I need to be able to convert that connection string into something that the entity framework can understand. And so that's what it's doing right down here, is I'm using the entity connection string builder and basically specifying the metadata and the provider type. So what I need to do is I need to leverage this connection string. So if I go into my web config, the entity framework automatically put one in here, but I want to change the name of it. And then I also want to remove those attributes because it's going to actually put that in there using my connection util. So I just want a regular plain Jane connection string, which is, again, what Azure is going to do for me as well. So there we go. I have a connection string, and that guy is ready to rock and roll now. So the last thing that I'm going to do in this app, we are almost completely done. The only things that I need now is I have a special file. So what's cool is there's no smoke and mirrors going on in this app. We actually are taking a profile picture and a mustache picture and making a mashup and creating a new image out of it. The only smoke and mirrors is I cropped it to make sure the face was always in the right place. So what I'm going to do is I have a little code snippet that's going to do that for us, that's going to create the mashup. So let me go ahead and insert that, and I'll put it under my submit button. Other. And this is get bytes. So again, you guys can have all this code. There's some interesting things here of how it's going out and getting the bytes of these images. Because again, behind the scenes, we're doing things over OAuth. So you can't just make a normal web request. So let me make sure I reference all my everything here. All right. And then finally, I need to handle my button submit. So I'll go ahead and insert my last snippet, and I'll kind of show you what's going on in there. So this is my submit. So if you look at my submit, I'm basically getting the file bytes. Using the client-side object model, I'm writing it to a library, my Movember library. I'm then using my entity model to create a new database record. Super simple. I mean, that's one of the beauties of the entity framework is I just do a simple thing like that. Rebinding my history list. And then the last thing I'm doing, which is really important, is I want to post that Movember picture to the newsfeed. So you can see I'm using the social feed manager, and I'm creating a new post that said, it shows the picture. I'm using a social attachment and adding it to the newsfeed. So that's our app. It's all done. I won't, in this case, for the sake of time, I'm not going to redeploy it, but basically that's the exact same thing that we demonstrated at the beginning. So I want to jump over and I want to show you guys maybe another way. So this was kind of a fun app to illustrate some of the concepts of how we put these auto-hosted apps together. I want to talk about one other thing that I found really important. So as I started building some of these apps, one of the first things that kind of I thought about was, well, what about like admin settings for the app? So in this Movember one, maybe I want to go out and add new mustaches, right? Now that maybe is an admin type of thing. How can I create things that are part of this app that have permissions to a specific user? So I see there being two approaches to this. One is I can leverage the SharePoint permissions from the app web. So, and this is really important. This is important because I'm going to the app web, not the host web. If I go to the host web, I have to give really elevated permissions to even check permissions. So that's kind of a weird thing. But I can check permissions against the app web. So, for instance, if Nathan has the ability to manage the web, what I might want to do is let him be an administrator of the app itself. The other thing I could do is I could store my own permission model, and I could get as creative as you want using something like the app storage. So in SQL Azure, or something else. The important thing here, I would say, is that you guys need to be really careful about making sure that you seed this the right way, right? So if I'm using app storage, how do I get the initial record for who the first administrator is? You got to really think about that. So I wanted to maybe show you guys one more app that's really a little bit more real world. So at Microsoft, we have a really popular application called Kudos. It's a way for us to send employee recognition to another employee. So if I thought Nathan did really good on something, I can go out to Kudos and I can send kudos. And when I send kudos to him, it goes to a news feed, it goes to, an email goes to both of our managers, and it's a really great way to recognize people. So I see this as being a very real application that people could use. And I built this in kind of two flavors. I did the first iteration of this using very basic requirements. All I want to do is be able to send it, I want to put it on the news feed, and I want to be able to maybe do some some email along with it. However, and you guys will get both of these solutions at the end, I wanted to maybe have a second part of this that might be a little bit more complex. So instead of maybe using basic list storage, let's leverage SQL Azure. Let's actually let someone select a badge for a user. So if I want to send Nathan a kudos, maybe it's for a specific topic. So in this case, we're going to actually have a badge that they can select. We also are going to have admin settings here. Maybe I want to specify a quota for the number of kudos that you can send in a week or a month. I also might want to let an admin go and actually specify the badges that are available. So let's jump over and we'll take a look at what kudos looks like. So let me show you the final version of this. Hopefully this one will cooperate a little bit more with us. I have a completed one, but I think this one will be more cooperative. All right, so here's our app. You can see that on the left side, I have a place where I can send kudos. On the right side, this is my history, and I just redeployed this just now, so I cleared out the database. But ultimately, what this would show me is all the kudos that I've sent, all the kudos that I've received over time. What I can also do in here is, as an admin, I have special admin settings. So you can see I have admin settings for Contact Us is available for everyone, but I have admin settings, and I also have badge management. So, for instance, if I go to badge management and click on that, this is now in the app web. Notice the URL here. The URL is back in SharePoint. It happens to be in the app web, not the host web, the app web. But this is where I'm storing all of my badges. So I have a number of different badges that are here. If I were to go back to the app here really quickly.
Wrong app.
Oh, wrong app. Looks like it's this one. So the other thing that I have in here is I have admin settings. So if I go into admin settings here, I can specify a lot of details. Do I want to use a quota? If I use a quota, what is it? So quota would be, we're not going to let you just go crazy sending, 1 million kudos a week. So we're going to limit it to 4. We're going to limit it weekly, and then I can specify whether I want it to post to the news feed and who gets emailed. So I have a lot of detail that I can do in there. The next thing I want to do is go ahead and send one. So let's send kudos to maybe Anne. So this is another thing, and I'll show you this. There's some really cool, if you guys have used the people pickers in SharePoint 2010, they're very client-side friendly. So they actually, as you start typing, it populates. It has really nice hints. Interestingly, we don't have any documentation out there on there yet. So using Fiddler, I found that there's a really nice client-side API to do people lookups. And so in this case, I'm doing a people lookup. If I were to shorten this or change it to, so you can see here we have a bunch of people that start with A. I'll go ahead and pick Anne, say go. You can see that I have Anne's picture here. Again, I'm outside of SharePoint, but I'm able to connect back in and get her name, her email address, her picture. I'm also connecting in and pulling in those badges. So if I wanted to go look at a different badge, maybe I want to send her a badge for innovative idea, I can pick a different badge, and I'll just say, hey, fantastic job on the ideas. You are an idea king. And I'll go ahead and say send. So that's going to submit this back to SQL Azure. It's going to store it in SQL Azure, and as soon as it's done refreshing, we can see that it's now in my sent list. So I can actually see that I have the activity showing up in my sent items. A few other things that are going on here, if I were to go back to the main screen and look on the news feed, the other thing that this did is it went ahead and posted that on the news feed. So you can see I sent Ann Wallace. In fact, it's using an @mention of Ann, a kudos for innovative idea. Here's the text. There's the badge. And you notice that it even shows me at the bottom that it was sent via kudos employee recognition. So really cool, very usable app. Again, I'll give you guys all the code to this. You can deploy it in your own organization if you want. The other cool thing is if I go to Outlook here, what we'll see is that it also went ahead and sent an email. So we can use SharePoint utilities to be able to do things like send emails. So you can see here it sent an email. They don't have managers set up, but it would actually send it to managers too if we wanted. So that's the end solution. For the sake of time, I'm going to just show maybe two things in here that I think are pretty interesting. One is, how did I set up those links in the navigation for app settings, you know, when I have some people that are administrators and some that aren't. So the way I did that is if I go into, one of the things that I did is I created a base page for all my pages. And what that base page does is it actually goes and checks the effective permissions of the current user. So that's what you're seeing here is my base page is going to say, you know, let's look at the permissions. And if they have manage web permissions, then we're going to output specific script into the page. So if I scroll down here, you'll see where I'm checking that if they have manage permissions, then we're going to go ahead and give them links for app settings and badge management. If they don't have manage permissions, it will omit those from the links that display at the top of the screen. The other thing I wanted to show you guys, and again, you'll have the code for this, but I think it's interesting, is the ability to leverage that client API to do the people picker. So it's a really neat, again, just using Fiddler, you were able to find this out, but in the sp.ui.application pages, there is a client people picker web service interface that I can basically just send in a query and it'll bring me back a JSON feed of users. So a really great way to do the same sort of capabilities inside your app if you want to. So we saw Movember, a little bit more fun and not maybe as relevant, but possibly could for an HR organization. And then obviously Kudos could have a lot of value. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Nathan, and we're going to talk a little bit about licensing.
So when we look at kind of licensing and I guess more some of the usage models, one thing to kind of keynote on this is we said earlier is this is actually it's leveraging Azure, but this is not your Azure tenant in these auto-deployed accounts. This is actually using the Microsoft tenant that's out there. The app catalog is really for organizational deployments. So if you're going to deploy apps and deploy them in your enterprise, like what Richard did, you can actually grab that app file, give it to the admin, upload it to your tenant, and deploy it that way. The SharePoint store is meant for ISVs or meant for selling apps or distributing apps to larger communities outside of your organization. We do have, because it's a Microsoft tenant on Azure, we do have usage models just like Azure does. And so you look in here, this is actually some of the usage that we do, usage throttling. So think about this as kind of a resource model, very similar to like Sandbox solutions on how they work. So storage, you get a gig, memory usage, and then the data output, very similar to the Azure model today.
So just a few key takeaways. So first of all, easy to develop. I mean, you guys saw, obviously I had some code snippets, but you know, being able to put together an app that in like 30 seconds of me going to deploy went and created its own website in Azure, its own SQL Azure database, and if I had workflow in there, it'd create that too. For me to be able to deploy that, geographically distributed too, from a DR perspective in like 30 seconds, That's amazing. That's so easy for me to be able to do things like that. It leverages the tool set that you guys know today as a developer. Simplified upgrades. So we really need to talk about this, but inside the app manifest, I can specify my app version number. And if I wanted to create a new version of the app, I can put that out there, and those can kind of run side by side. So it's very easy for me to upgrade my apps. This is great from a, we found that farm solutions can cripple customers in upgrading, right? Because you write something and it's leveraging, maybe something very specific, and, doing the upgrade might be invasive on that to be able to do the upgrade. So the idea behind these apps are they run outside of SharePoint. You should never have fear of being able to upgrade things because they do run outside of SharePoint. They're obviously cloud ready. I mean, these guys are cloud ready in that I can run them in Office 365. I can run them, where my app itself runs within Azure, so they're really a first-class citizen of the cloud. I can have very rich SharePoint integration. So we only touched on a few of the APIs, user profiles, social, some of the web APIs. But there's a number of APIs. Hopefully you guys have seen them. If I want to use search, if I want to look at taxonomies, all of that's available to me. And very low-cost entry for developers. So you guys, no longer do you have to have these bulky environments. In fact, I won't hold it up here, but I've moved my developer machine. I used to have the big laptop that I put in my bag and broke my back all the time trying to carry it. I'm just using a little X220 laptop right now. I mean, there's nothing powerful at all, but it's perfect for doing these development.
And also on the tenant side, if you guys haven't done this yet, you can go out there and provision a developer tenant as well. So it gives you a one-user account to test and deploy apps to.
Last thing is I'm not looking to make money on these apps. These were just kind of for fun ones. But I do have 3 different apps out there that you can go pull down the code for, all the code that we used here. So the Movember app, if anyone wants to actually add that to their site, I'd be truly honored. Employee recognition, the basic one that actually, to be quite honest, the basic one could have been developed as a SharePoint hosted app. You could do most of the capabilities in there, client side, or I'm sorry, in JavaScript. But this happens to be auto-hosted. And then the advanced one that does a lot of things. It stores things in SQL. It does reporting. It does, all the badging. All of those you can go and pull down the code for. And feel free to leverage it however you want. And with that, a few other just little ancillary things. Please go fill out evaluations. Hopefully you guys, to me, this is such an exciting topic, the auto-hosted apps. It's amazing what we can do in the cloud now. And if you guys enjoyed the session, I really encourage you to go out, fill out evaluations for this. And really with that, if you guys have any questions for us, we'd be happy to try to answer those. Yes?
So, about the slide you mentioned that support for auto-hosted apps is coming soon to SharePoint Store. What does that mean? Are you saying that you can today just for an enterprise app, you can actually use auto-hosted apps?
So let me just repeat the question. So the question was a few slides back. It said that support for auto-hosted apps within the SharePoint store coming. Yeah, so the store is basically going to support to where I can go out and basically, if I create a developer account out there, I'm going to be able to take that .app file and I'm going to be able to go and basically submit it to the store. Now, it'll go through code reviews and things like that where we'll analyze the code. But ultimately, once it does that, it will be in the store, and there will be a whole revenue model for you to go and be able to sell your apps in the store.
But to your point, though, the auto-hosted app right now is it's still in kind of final preview mode. So once we kind of go and finalize the tooling and the release, that's really when we'll have more of that store model. So right now we're looking at for preview and for testing, but with more tooling coming to kind of finalize it.
Yep.
I want to make sure, is this on? I guess not.
Yeah.
I guess it's a fundamental misunderstanding. Back in the SDR earlier in the year. Auto-hosted, does whoever's installing that app need to have an Azure account and charge for that? Or is there going to some like common pool of that?
That's right.
Yeah, so the short answer is, in the end, that tenant is getting charged for it. So the way that this is going to work is that you're going to have Apps in the store are going to have cost associated with them. You might, a developer might offer it for free, but it's going to also possibly have a cost associated with it. For the apps that I might want to develop in-house as an enterprise app and put in the app catalog, what we're saying is that in Office 365, you're going to get a certain number of licenses. And a license would be like one user per app per period of time. And ultimately, I get some allotment of those, and then when my allotment is up, I can go buy more if I want. So in a sense, you're ultimately paying for it, but the only way you're going to directly pay for it is if I need to buy more seats or in maybe the store model where I'm actually buying the app. But you're not going to get, by default, if you're within your allotment, you're not going to get the separate Azure bill coming to you. Does that make sense? Absolutely. Perfect. Yes?
You mentioned with the SharePoint hosted apps, when you're querying like a list, you have to do it through Camel. There's no link to link to SharePoint or some of the other like client-side querying available.
So there might be. I haven't played with that in there.
I mean, I can see that you don't have a like SP Metal to then run against a cloud tenant and get the object model for it. But.
Yeah. So I don't remember. So I had varying experience with SP Metal, but that wasn't part of the client-side API. That was more our farm solution, right?
Server side,
yeah. And I don't believe we've made that client-side enabled, so it's not remotable yet. I don't believe so. Other questions? Everyone going to go build apps now? Oh wait, got enough. So there's kind of two upgrades that can happen, right? There's the upgrade of the tenant, or there's the upgrade of the app. When I upgrade the app, so I'm at my app, my app file, that changes. Ultimately, that can run side by side. So I would create a new instance of that, and I could do things to move my data. The upgrade of the tenancy. So right now, the auto-hosted apps are really geared towards Office 365. And that stuff, we're going to deal with the complexities of it. So if there's some sort of changes to list or libraries, that's one of the benefits of Office 365 is you don't have to deal with the upgrade of that. We deal with it. So. Correct. Okay, so if I have V1 and I want to get V2 of the app, how do I might need to follow up on that. I haven't seen the direct upgrade path for that. Other questions? Thanks a lot, guys. Appreciate it.